This morning I'm going to be talking about some research work we've been undertaking at Aix-Marseille University and within a network of universities in what we rather pretentiously call Le Grand Sud of France, which of course means not Paris, pas le centre jacobin. And so it's a network of universities within Commonwealth studies, essentially, but what brings us together is a common research theme of critical geographies, and what I'm particularly interested in is critical geopolitics and critical geopolitics approach to commemoration. This research has been supported of late by the AMU Aix-Marseille University Foundation, which has seed funded Shanti's recent fellowship at Aix-Marseille University and work that we have done on Le Camp des Milles, so the relatively new memorial museum to the deportation, which is in Aix-en-Provence. That's one aspect of our research. I won't be talking about that today. Another aspect is an ongoing interest in the First World War, with our master's students who are doing field work on the ground, looking at sites of memory in the region, and particularly the Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemetery in Marseille, which brings together allied the war dead from both the First World War and the Second World War, majority First World War. Now, my interest in memorial diplomacy, which I'm just going to briefly outline here as a set of commemorative policies and practices which seek to mobilize a shared sense of collective memory and transnational history as a vehicle for international relations. The expression I use, memorial diplomacy, and that I outlined in this book that Shanti co-edited with Ben Wellings, Nation, Memory and Great War Commemoration, in a chapter on French-Australian memorial diplomacy. Peter Stanley refers to as soft diplomacy, and Joan Beaumont as Australia's global footprint, and she writes of the growing importance, I quote, in extraterritorial commemoration of memorial diplomacy and the development of a shared memory between Australians and the communities which host their memorials. Now, I have two approaches to memorial diplomacy. One is a top-down approach, which looks at state commemoration and essentially is a survey of the centenary to date, the events and their diplomatic dimension. And that I'm not really going to talk about today. I'm going to look at the bottom-up approach through site and through a critical geopolitics approach to regional site and local site. But I will just touch briefly on the event that James mentioned, and that was the inaugural event for the British Centenary Programme at Glasgow Cathedral, so on the 4th of August 2014, which brought together Commonwealth leaders and the UK Prime Minister and, of course, the Scottish First Minister in a service of remembrance against the backdrop of the Commonwealth Games as a venue for a gesture of unity and sacrifice, as it were, of Commonwealth leaders, but, of course, which led to a dissonant note between the Scottish First Minister's text and subtext, which was about the Scottish contribution, Scottish losses, Scottish sacrifice against the background of the independence referendum on the 18th of September 2014, and particularly in that particular line within the Scottish Nationalist Party that George Reid notably had pressed for, which was for the Nationalist Party to develop its links with its Scottish diaspora overseas. Particularly interested George Reid when he came to Aix-Marseille in the Canadian diaspora, the Scottish diaspora in Canada. David Cameron's discourse at that event very much directed towards, as James mentioned, the Lights Out campaign and this invitation for UK citizens to become personally involved in a performative way in the commemoration. And of course that very much pressing his message of the unionist inflection of his message. And one thing that strikes me listening to James and the rest of you is that in France we have had a relative continuity in terms of political transitions, in terms of perhaps approaches to state commemoration, whereas in the UK, one of the interesting things we can look at is this point of, how should I, rupture that has been the Brexit referendum, and the question that I'd like to put to James later is how has that inflected commemorative practice, commemorative agendas since. Now, this idea of the invisible spectrum, it's a little bit ambitious, and I regret it immediately having used that phrase. And now I'm sitting before you and sweating, I regret even more because it doesn't really stand up. Of course, what I'm trying to talk about is the less visible aspect, the bottom-up, the subaltern, the under-the-radar of state discourse. That's to say that commemorative diplomatic action that's sort of removed from state representative strategies. And that, of course, poses immediately the problem that you've all mentioned of traceability, as it were. How do you measure that? Now, just to come back to basics of memorial diplomacy, a premise of public diplomacy, of which memorial diplomacy is an aspect, is in its commemorative mode. It involves not just state to citizen, but citizen to state and citizen to citizen agency, or agencies. And that, of course, belies the assumption that commemorative observance is essentially top-down and conducted by state agencies acting on an intergovernmental plane within that visible spectrum of conventional discourse and media. I'm trying to justify it desperately. It's not going to work, you understand. So this paper looks instead to the less visible spectrum of experience, to the significance of remembrance for individual citizens, families, and communities. Even as public agencies strive to shape the form and meanings of commemoration, civil society provides its storied content and effective substance. Or is that what state commemorative agencies want us to believe? Listening to James, that is immediately a response that I've had that has punched a hole in that particular argument. So the challenge for historians and social scientists is to understand how remembrance is experienced at grassroots level. We've all understood that through the home, the workplace, the local community, and measure its larger impact. And this is where I need my students, boots on the ground. The approach I propose, or we've proposed here, is site-specific. We've focused on the recorded experiences of visitors to the Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery at Mazargues in Marseille since 2012. And through the first 3 years of the centenary, considered against the backdrop of official commemorative activities at the local and regional levels. Now, there's an aspect of this which is digital, which Shanti has come to help us prepare, but I'm not going to speak about that today, since my students are about to set out on that fieldwork to look at blogs and other digital responses to these sites. I'm going to look at I'm going to be old-fashioned and go back to pen and paper, as you shall see. I'm going to compare and contrast memory in the minor key at a site on the threshold of the International Remembrance Trails with the macro messaging of state-driven commemoration on a national scale. And this approach seeks to highlight the overlapping, competing, and potentially conflicting claims of community, nationalism, and internationalism in the identity politics of the centenary. That's rather ambitious. So the methodology I outlined was the critical geographies. Klaus Dodds came to speak to us, to our network in 2015 in Toulouse, and he set out his vision of what a critical geopolitics could be, should be perhaps, a rejection of orthodox geopolitics, very much in the mode of, he's very inspired by the French geopoliticians, Yves Lacoste and his work on the Vietnam War going back to 1972. He spoke interestingly about it being about topology, networks, links, nodes, flows of information, and not topography. And he added that he was particularly interested in the relation between metaphorical space and material space. Now, this set me thinking about the particularities of Marseille and the PACA region, so Provence-Alpes-Côte d'Azur, or what we pretentiously call the Grand Sud when we don't include Lyon, as a field of memory. And this is something I've attempted to define with my colleague from the University of Sydney, Elizabeth Rekniewski, in Portland in 2010. We were interested in the way that a field of memory anchors memory in material objects such as monuments, memorials, and topographical sites that become a field for recollection, a framework for rituals of remembrance. And the very topography of place or the form of a monument can become, can take on a metonymic quality, imposing a context and channeling certain forms of remembering. Now, that I wasn't particularly satisfied with as a sort of loose definition. But since then, I've become interested in Augustin Berck and his work on what he calls médiance, that is to say, our special relationship to place. And he distinguishes between a topos, mappable space, and what he calls chora, or existential space. And he says that chora, existential space, is at once a footprint, an empreinte, and a matrix or a matrice. And what he means by that is that in the chora, the human and the environmental shape each other in constant movement and exchange. So if you want to, if you're not familiar with that, that's in the two works that he brought out, two volumes he brought out in 2000, Ecumène and Médiance. I can provide, of course, the full references for that. So thinking in terms of this field of memory and Marseille and the PACA region as a chora, as it were, as an interactive space between the human and the environmental, a certain monumental landscape, leads me to, sorry, I'll just come on to how, if I can give you some of the topology rather than the topography of that space. So it's a landscape that is dominated by a certain number of monuments. The key monument, the First World War monument, Monument aux Morts des Armées d'Orient, which is on the Corniche in Marseille. This was dedicated to the heroes of the Army of the Orient and distant lands, Les Terres Lointaines. And it was part of a radical project by the municipal architect, Gaston Castel, to build a voie sacrée, a kind of Anzac parade, grandeur nature, in Marseille to, in fact, transform the urban landscape into a living memorial to the victims of the First World War. Gaston Castel himself was a mutilé de guerre, so he was a veteran, and he was passionately, if you like, inspired to attempt that. This is really a remnant or the rump of that project. It was part of what he was able to do. Another aspect of the memorial that I spoke about earlier is the Pax monument outside the prefecture, which is an interwar monument, again built by Castel in October 1934. It's actually to commemorate a very specific event, which is the assassination of King Alexander I of Yugoslavia by probably Italian agents working through Balkan sort of intermediaries, and Louis Barthou, the French foreign minister, in October of 1934 during a state visit. But of course it's a pacifist interwar monument that takes on a certain importance during the Second World War because it's diverted into an anti-Nazi gathering place, a site of resistance, as it were, symbolically, after the occupation of the zone libre, of the Vichy zone in 1942. And finally, Le Camp des Milles, as part of this memorial landscape, and the relatively new museum memorial to the deportation and genocide, of which Chanty has been writing of late. And further afield, the Montfaron, a memorial to the Provence landings. This is Second World War memory. And perhaps is one of the key sites internationally in terms of international diplomacy. It was originally, as it were, instrumentalized by de Gaulle in 1964 at the time of the launch of the French nuclear deterrent. Because of its proximity to the Plateau d'Albion, one suspects, and the missiles. But under the presidency of Chirac and later presidency of Sarkozy, It's been used as an opportunity to enact symbolic reconciliation with France's ex-African colonies, notably in the Maghreb and West Africa, against a background of a number of issues to do with veterans' pensions, notably the tirailleurs sénégalais, which have also been treated against this background. Now, the Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery, which interests us, is therefore to some extent on the periphery of this memorial landscape in the region. It's on the geographical periphery of Marseille. It's in the 9th arrondissement, so it's quite difficult to get to. It's one of the outlying villages of Marseille, in which our geography students work actively in terms of urban planning. Although in terms of visits, it's for war tourism, it's convenient in the sense it's close to Le Corbusier's La Cité Radieuse. It contains the graves of some 1,750 World War I and World War II soldiers, sailors, aviators, and significantly laborers and auxiliaries of the British Empire and Allied forces, including Americans, previously interred in 4 cemeteries of the city and regrouped from 1919 onwards in this particular site. Roughly 85%, that's about 1,500 of the tombs are from the First World War, and that includes the most significant number are Indian, roughly 1,000 Indian tombs. Now, the Mazarg Indian Memorial was unveiled in 1925 by Field Marshal Birdwood. Marseille, of course, was the base, the HQ of the Indian Army, the Imperial Army, during the First World War. Nationalities: Indian, Chinese, Fijian, British, Australian, New Zealand, Canadian, South African. There is even a Japanese tomb. And its importance, of course, is in terms of its colonial dimension. These are colonial soldiers, and notably the laborers. And there's been particular academic interest. You'll be familiar with Lima's work on les travailleurs chinois dans la Première Guerre mondiale, which has become a reference. It was published in 2012 by the CNRS. There's some pictures of the cemetery, and here is the ground plan where you'll see the plots and the various national groups: Indians and Chinese, laborers notably from Hong Kong, Egyptians. BWI is British West Indian Regiment. There is one aspect we're looking into, I have no time to discuss now, but it was a mutiny of the British West Indian Regiment when it was stationed in the Marseille region. It was used as a labor corps, effectively, and not a fighting unit. So the two cemeteries, the communal and the Mazarg War Cemetery, are separated by a wall, and you can only enter the Commonwealth Cemetery through this back door, effectively through the communal cemetery. And this monument to the war dead of Mazarg, 1914-18, was inaugurated by the mayor of the 9th and 10th arrondissement, so he's républicain now, Guy Tessier, in 2016, in which he spoke of the desire of the Marseillais to preserve the memory and the heroism of the poilus, the veterans, but in which he made no mention whatsoever of the Commonwealth war dead in the cemetery just behind the wall and through the door. Interesting. Now, how are the Commonwealth war dead? And here you have a period map from the First World War that was published in the local press, showing the provenance of the colonial troops, the Allies. How are they? What are the keynote cemeteries in this keynote commemorative moments around this cemetery? Well, there's a Remembrance Sunday ceremony, which is organized essentially by the Royal British Legion with parishioners of the local expatriate community, the All Saints Church in Marseille. So I'll just take you through some of the period postcards. We have a colleague who's working, Gilles Tellier, who's working on postcards as a form of instant memory, as it were, sort of the SMS of the First World War. and showing the arrival of the Indian First Army Corps in Marseille in the period, and then later, of course, in the spring of 1916, the Anzacs. I'll be talking about them later, the Australians, the New Zealanders. And here's a Remembrance Sunday service. So the Remembrance Sunday is a relatively formal, repeated commemorative moment. It's not the one I'm most interested in. I'm particularly interested in what Nigel Thrift calls in his famous chapter, The Little Things, the mundane objects like files, mundane people, like Clark's mundane works like which are crucial to how the geopolitical is translated into being. So with our students, the idea came to us that we needed to look at this mundane commemorative observance of the cemetery, and how we would get there is through this particular portal, the cemetery register. So we're going back to basics, back to pen and paper, as it were, and looking at how visitors respond to the cemetery. And I've given you here just a selection of those responses, and if I can summarize what we've found so far. There's a certain formalism in commemorative responses. The in memoriam, RIP, rest in peace, the acknowledgement of the sacrifice of the war dead, the beauty of the cemetery often, and the well-tended landscape, the peacefulness of the site, the emotion it inspires, and the always moving Remembrance Sundays. So about a third of the entries concern the First World War, 2/3 the Second World War. Occasionally, they're accompanied by photographic and literary tributes. I'll show you a couple in a moment. And a minority of entries express pacifist, anti-war or anti-colonial sentiments. Why, as one of them puts it. So I've given you a typical entry here. Is I finally had a chance to see my grandfather's memorial. So this is clearly a Sikh Indian visitor. He's gone 99 years. We love and miss him. Then you have, amongst French visitors, the Merci pour ceux qui ont combattu pour nous, which is not such a rare sentiment as one might expect. Somebody who's commemorating a member of the Burma Labour Corps. Somebody who's working, a researcher, several researchers have filled in the register, working on les tombes chinoises, so in other words, the labourers. An anonymous tribute to the black servicemen in World War I, preserving our history and heritage, our history, our heritage, sort of underlined, as it were. More mention of the Indians transmitting photos to descendants in les îles Mauritius. Canadian tribute to commanders from the Second World War. And here a very pointed commentary on the colonial dimension, en souvenir de tous les colonisés qui se battaient pour le colonisateur. Right. Merci pour votre sacrifice, and here a sentiment that is perhaps not one that the state would like to read. Sinon aujourd'hui je parlerai allemand. So rather anti-German, balanced perhaps by the German entry. Such cemeteries are very important, unfortunately. Thank you for your work for peace. My rough translation, my wife's the German teacher, not me, I think, correct me. And finally, and yet the killing goes on. We also have this kind of tribute, you have pasted into the registry a poem by a young New Zealand boy who's attending in 2017 with his parents. I'll just give the end of the poem, hoping it never happens again. In our heart somewhere, they still remain, we will remember them. 2017, and photographic evidence. This is a Canadian soldier with relatives, possibly Polish. I'd have to look into this. Daniel, I'm not sure. The Special Forces member. So these mementos. Now, against this, there have only been two major commemorative moments in the whole centenary so far in Marseille. The first is a rather unusual one. It's in 2014, the end of 2014. What you see here is a platoon of Sikh soldiers marching in a reconstitution of the landing of Indian Army forces in 1914. Now, we've looked into this, and this is effectively commemoration organized to some extent bottom up by the Sikh Council of France, possibly with the support of the United Sikhs, which is an international network. But it's clearly not an Indian government initiative. Okay? And interestingly, it went nowhere near the Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery. Okay? It did receive some support from the prefectural and municipal authorities who were in attendance. There's not much evidence of popular participation. And Peter Stanley, and this is a plug, this is my plug moment. Peter Stanley in Shanti's forthcoming book, I've got it somewhere, I'll get back to it, I've lost it, sorry, I had a plug, on commemorating race and empire, which is due out at the end of the year, writes that expatriate connection with Indian martial endeavor is strongest in the Sikh community, but relatively weak among Muslim immigrants. Okay, so here again, this is from the Revue de Marseille in 2014, publishing photos of the Sikh presence in Marseille. So that's the quotation I just... Stanley goes on to point out that Prime Minister Modi became rather belatedly interested in the potential of the centenary for projection of India diplomatically, yeah. And but his emphasis was on the Indian army as not as a multi-faith force, but as a sectarian vision that celebrates its Hindu component. And so the question here is whether we're in the presence of a counter-memory, effectively. I believe so. The second commemoration was part of the New Zealand, very formal New Zealand WW100 commemorative program. And it's a service of gratitude at Mazarg, which took place in presence of the New Zealand ambassador to France, the chairman of the Mission Centenaire, but the interesting dissonance there, it concerned only 6 New Zealand tombs in the cemetery. There are only 6 New Zealanders actually buried in the cemetery. So we were rather intrigued at why New Zealand should spend so much time on this particular cemetery. And I realized, and here's something that Sir Lawrence and you were evoking earlier, that it was something to do with us, that back in 2014, one of my students had been doing some field work at the cemetery, and she got involved in a private initiative, as you can see here, organized by a Malaysian Chinese immigrant to New Zealand called the Dolores Cross Project, which was to identify the tombs of New Zealand soldiers overseas and to place a simple palm cross on them and to take photographic evidence, which was sent back and became an archive. Now, she was involved with that, and we believe that this attracted the attention of the New Zealand centenary authorities to the Mazarg Cemetery and perhaps resulted in this observance. Now, I'm going to conclude. So what I've tried to set out is a critical geopolitical approach, or what I'm trying to outline, of a parallel agenda, what Thrift calls a parallel agenda for critical geopolitics, one still based on discourse, but discourse understood, and these are my italics, in a broader way, less taken with representation, more attuned to actual practices. So what I was particularly interested in here is the constant hum of practices and their attendant territorialization. So it's an attempt to build an approach to extraterritorial commemoration and memorial diplomacy from below, from the perspective of the communities which host and the visitors who animate the memorial sites, thereby exploring what we might call the personalist dimension to public diplomacy and its glocal memory footprint. Thank you.